killer whose identity has long remained a mystery
That is.
until now.
Yeah, DNA from a shawl recovered at the scene of one of his crimes has incredibly found a 100% match.
After 137 years, DNA from a crime scene shawl has revealed Jack the Ripper's true identity. And you won't believe who it is. The police knew his name the entire time but couldn't stop him. He walked the same streets as his victims, hiding in plain sight while the world searched for a monster. What scientists discovered will send chills down your spine.
The Ripper's crimes terrorized the residents of London. No one was even charged, although the police have had their suspicions. Now, more than a century later, modern technology may have finally unmasked the elusive killer.
The man behind history's most notorious murders has finally been exposed. And the truth is more shocking than anyone imagined. Everything you thought you knew about Jack the Ripper was wrong. The breakthrough centers on a Victorian-era shawl that was reportedly recovered from the crime scene where Catherine Eddowes, widely considered the Ripper's fourth victim, was murdered on September 30th, 1888. This piece of fabric, stained and weathered by more than a century of existence, had been passed down through private hands for decades. For years, many experts dismissed it as just another dubious artifact, one of countless supposed Ripper relics that have surfaced over the years, most of which turned out to be either fakes or items with no genuine connection to the case. The shawl's journey to scientific examination began in 2007, when Russell Edwards, a British author with a deep interest in the Jack the Ripper case, purchased it at auction. Edwards was convinced that the shawl was authentic and that it might hold the key to solving the mystery that had eluded investigators for more than 100 years. Unlike many collectors who simply want to own a piece of history, Edwards had a specific goal in mind. He wanted to subject the fabric to modern forensic testing, using technology that wouldn't have been imaginable in the Victorian era. To accomplish this, Edwards sought out Dr. Jari Louhelainen, a molecular biologist with specialized expertise in extracting and analyzing genetic material from old, degraded samples. This wasn't a straightforward task by any means. The shawl was over 120 years old at the time of testing, and it had been handled by numerous people over the decades. Environmental factors, time, and repeated contact had all taken their toll on any biological evidence that might remain. The challenge was immense. Modern crime dramas often show DNA analysis as quick and simple, but extracting usable genetic material from a Victorian-era piece of silk required cutting-edge techniques and painstaking work. Dr. Louhelainen and his team focused their attention on the stains visible on the fabric. Using advanced molecular biology methods, they carefully worked to extract whatever genetic material might still be present. Their approach centered on something called mitochondrial DNA, often abbreviated as mtDNA. Understanding what makes mitochondrial DNA special is important to grasping why this type of genetic evidence can survive so long and why it was chosen for this particular investigation. Unlike nuclear DNA, which we inherit from both our mother and father in roughly equal measure, mitochondrial DNA follows a different pattern. It passes exclusively through the maternal line. A person inherits their mtDNA from their mother, who inherited it from her mother, who inherited it from her mother, and so on, creating an unbroken chain that can stretch back thousands of years. This inheritance pattern makes mtDNA particularly valuable for certain types of genetic investigation. Additionally, mtDNA is remarkably durable compared to nuclear DNA. Each cell contains many more copies of mitochondrial DNA than nuclear DNA, which means it has a much better chance of surviving in degraded samples. These characteristics make mtDNA ideal for testing old biological evidence where nuclear DNA might no longer be recoverable. The research team had two main objectives. First, they needed to verify whether the shawl was genuinely connected to the crime scene. Second, if it was authentic, they wanted to see if they could identify any genetic material from the perpetrator. To establish the shawl's authenticity, the team needed to confirm that the bloodstains on it belonged to Catherine Eddowes. This required finding a living maternal relative of Eddowes who could provide a DNA sample for comparison. The researchers managed to locate a descendant of Catherine Eddowes through her sister's family line. When they compared the mtDNA from this living relative to the genetic material extracted from the bloodstains on the shawl, they found a match. This was a significant finding in itself. It strongly suggested that the shawl had indeed been present at the crime scene, and that it had been stained with the victim's blood. The artifact that many had dismissed as a fake appeared to be genuine after all. But the blood stains weren't the only biological material present on the fabric. Mixed in with the victim's DNA, the research team found traces of other genetic material, including what appeared to be semen. This was potentially the most important evidence of all. If this genetic material came from the perpetrator, it could provide the definitive link that had eluded investigators for over a century. The question now was whether they could identify who this genetic material belonged to. By this point in their investigation, the research team had a suspect in mind. This wasn't a new theory or a previously unknown name. In fact, the suspect they were focusing on had been at the top of the police's list back in the 1880s. To test their hypothesis, they needed to find a living maternal descendant of this suspect's family. Once again, they succeeded in locating a female line relative who agreed to provide a DNA sample for comparison. When the results came back, they showed a match. The mitochondrial DNA from the semen traces on the shawl corresponded to the DNA of the suspect's descendant. After 137 years, modern science appeared to have identified the person responsible for one of history's most notorious series of murders. The name that emerged from this analysis was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant who had lived and worked in the Whitechapel area of London during the exact period when the murders took place. For those familiar with the Jack the Ripper case, this name might not come as a complete surprise. Aaron Kosminski wasn't some obscure figure pulled from historical records at random. He had been a person of significant interest to the Victorian police who investigated the original crimes. In fact, some of the senior officers involved in the investigation had explicitly named him as their prime suspect in documents written years after the murders ended. The DNA findings weren't introducing a new suspect to the story. Rather, they appeared to be confirming what the detectives closest to the case had believed all along. Aaron Kosminski was not a wealthy man, nor was he someone who moved in influential circles. He was an immigrant from Poland who had come to London seeking a better life, like thousands of others who arrived in Britain during the late 19th century. Kosminski worked as a hairdresser in Whitechapel, the very neighborhood where the murders took place. His occupation placed him squarely in the heart of the area that would become synonymous with terror during the autumn of 1888. He lived among the narrow streets, the cramped lodging houses, and the desperate poverty that defined the East End. He knew the area intimately, understanding its layout, its rhythms, and its inhabitants in a way that only a local resident could. What made Kosminski particularly notable to investigators, both then and now, was his documented mental instability. According to historical records and police notes, he suffered from severe psychological problems. Witnesses and records from the period describe him as someone who experienced disturbing visions and exhibited violent tendencies. His behavior was erratic, and those who knew him recognized that something was deeply wrong with his mental state. In an era when mental health treatment was primitive and often non-existent for the poor, Kosminski's condition went largely unaddressed for years. He remained in the community, free to move about Whitechapel despite his obvious problems. The connection between Kosminski and the Jack the Ripper case wasn't something discovered recently. Senior police officers who worked on the investigation left behind documents that clearly identified him as a primary suspect. One of the most significant pieces of evidence comes from Chief Constable Melville McNaughton, a high-ranking officer in the Metropolitan Police. In 1894, several years after the murders had ceased, McNaughton wrote a memorandum that has since become one of the most important documents in Ripper studies. In this memo, he listed 3 main suspects, and Kosminski was among them. McNaughton described him as someone who harbored a deep hatred of women and possessed what he called a strong homicidal tendency. These weren't vague suspicions or idle speculation. They were the considered opinions of a senior police official who had access to all the investigation files and who had discussed the case extensively with the officers who had worked on it from the beginning. Even more compelling is the testimony that comes from Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, the man who actually oversaw the day-to-day running of the Ripper investigation. Swanson was there on the ground throughout the period of the murders. He coordinated the searches, reviewed the evidence, interviewed witnesses, and managed the various teams of detectives working the case. If anyone had comprehensive knowledge of who the police suspected and why, it was Swanson. Years after he retired, Swanson received a copy of his former superior's memoirs. As he read through the book, he came across the section dealing with the Jack the Ripper case. In the margin next to this passage, Swanson made handwritten notes that have since been discovered and analyzed by historians. These marginal notes, which have come to be known as the Swanson marginalia, are extraordinarily revealing. Swanson wrote that the suspect was identified and placed under surveillance. He noted that the man was eventually sent to an asylum, where he remained until his death. Most significantly, Swanson named the suspect as Kosminski. This is not hearsay or secondhand information. This is the detective who led the investigation writing down, in his own hand, the name of the person he believed was responsible for the murders. The fact that he did so in a private note, written in a book for his own reading, gives the statement particular credibility. He had no reason to lie or exaggerate in a personal annotation made years after the case had closed. The geographical evidence supporting Kosminski as a suspect is also striking. He lived right in the middle of the area where all the murders occurred. The 5 canonical victims were all killed within a relatively small area of Whitechapel and the surrounding districts. Someone unfamiliar with the neighborhood would have struggled to navigate the dark, confusing maze of streets and alleyways, particularly at night and in the thick fog that often blanketed the East End. The perpetrator clearly knew the area well. He knew where to find vulnerable women, where to commit his crimes with minimal risk of immediate discovery, and how to disappear quickly into the surrounding streets. Kosminski, as a long-term resident who worked in the area, would have possessed exactly this kind of local knowledge. The timeline of events provides another compelling piece of circumstantial evidence. The canonical murders attributed to Jack the Ripper occurred between August and November of 1888. After the horrific killing of Mary Jane Kelly on November 9, 1888, the murders stopped. There were no more killings that bore the distinctive characteristics of the Ripper's work. This sudden cessation has always puzzled researchers. Serial killers rarely just stop of their own accord. Something must have prevented the perpetrator from continuing. In Kosminski's case, we have a clear explanation. In 1891, his family finally took action to have him institutionalized. He was committed to an asylum where he would remain for the rest of his life. Once confined, he obviously could no longer roam the streets of Whitechapel. The correlation between his institutionalization and the end of the murders is difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. Medical records show that Kosminski spent his final years in institutional care, dying in 1919 after nearly 3 decades of confinement. During his time in the asylum, he was described in various reports as suffering from auditory hallucinations and exhibiting bizarre behavior. The records paint a picture of a man with severe and untreated mental illness, someone whose grasp on reality was tenuous at best. While mental illness alone does not make someone a murderer, in Kosminski's case, it formed part of a broader pattern of evidence that pointed toward his involvement in the crimes. What makes this case particularly frustrating from a historical perspective is that the police apparently knew about Kosminski during the time the murders were actually happening. He was on their radar. Officers were aware of him, his mental state, and his presence in the area where the crimes occurred. Yet he was never arrested or charged. This raises an obvious and important question that has troubled researchers for decades. If the police suspected him so strongly, why didn't they take action? Why was he allowed to remain free? The answer lies in the limitations of Victorian-era law enforcement and the legal standards of the time. In 1888, police could not simply arrest someone because they seemed suspicious or even because they fit a profile. They needed concrete evidence that would stand up in court. Circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling it might seem, was not enough. Without witnesses who could positively identify a suspect, without physical evidence that could definitively link a person to a crime scene, and without forensic science to analyze biological material, the police were largely helpless. They could watch suspects, they could interview them, but they could not arrest them without solid proof. The police also faced another significant challenge. Many of the potential witnesses in Whitechapel were themselves people living on the margins of society. Some had criminal records. Others were involved in activities that they wanted to keep hidden from the authorities. Getting reliable testimony from such individuals was extremely difficult. Additionally, the lighting in the East End was poor, the fog was often thick, and most encounters on the dark streets were brief and partially obscured. Even genuine witnesses often gave contradictory descriptions of men they had seen with the victims shortly before their deaths. In Kosminski's case specifically, the police apparently had suspicions, but lacked the crucial evidence needed to bring charges. They continued to monitor him, hoping perhaps that he would make a mistake or that new evidence would emerge. Eventually, his own family solved the problem in a different way by having him committed. Once institutionalized, he was no longer a threat to the public, and the urgent need to build a criminal case against him diminished. The murders had stopped, and while the police may have had their private beliefs about who was responsible, they had no way to prove it in a court of law. To understand how these murders could have happened and why the killer was able to evade capture, it's essential to understand the world in which they took place. The London of 1888 was a city of stark contrasts and deep divisions. While the wealthy resided in elegant townhouses in the West End, enjoying the comforts and securities that money could provide, the East End was a completely different reality. Whitechapel and the surrounding districts represented one of the most impoverished, overcrowded, and desperate areas in the entire British Empire. It was a place where survival itself was a daily struggle for tens of thousands of people. The population density in the East End was staggering. More than 900,000 people were crammed into just a few square miles of urban space. The streets were narrow and poorly maintained, lined with crumbling buildings that had been subdivided and re-subdivided to extract maximum profit from minimal space. Alleys and courtyards branched off in confusing patterns, creating a labyrinth that was difficult to navigate even in daylight. At night, with minimal street lighting and frequent heavy fog, the area became a dark maze where anyone could easily become disoriented. The fog itself was a significant factor in the story of Jack the Ripper. Victorian London was notorious for its thick, choking fog, often called pea soupers because of their dense yellowish appearance. This wasn't natural mist rising from the River Thames. It was a toxic combination of water vapor, coal smoke from thousands of chimneys, and industrial pollution. On the worst nights, visibility could drop to just a few feet. People describe being unable to see their own hands when held at arm's length. For someone who wished to commit crimes unseen, this fog provided perfect cover. A person could attack someone in the street and vanish into the murky darkness within seconds, leaving no trace and no clear description for witnesses to provide. The economic conditions in Whitechapel created a population of extremely vulnerable people, particularly women. There was no social safety net, no unemployment benefits, no public housing. If you couldn't earn money, you couldn't eat, and you couldn't secure a place to sleep. The lodging houses that dominated the area offered basic accommodation for a few pence per night. These establishments were grim places, overcrowded and unsanitary, but they were better than sleeping on the street. For many of the poorest residents, particularly women who had limited employment options, earning enough money each day to pay for a bed was an ongoing challenge. The 5 women who are generally accepted as Jack the Ripper's victims were all caught in this desperate cycle. They were not young or glamorous. They were middle-aged women who had fallen on hard times through various circumstances, including failed marriages, alcoholism, illness, and simple bad luck. Popular culture often misrepresents these women, but the reality was more tragic and more mundane. They were people struggling to survive in an environment that offered few options and little mercy. When they couldn't raise the few pence needed for a bed, they would walk the streets late at night, trying to find some way to earn the money they needed. This made them particularly vulnerable to violence. The first murder that is definitively attributed to Jack the Ripper occurred on August 31st, 1888. Mary Ann Nichols, who was 43 years old, was found dead in Bucks Row, a narrow street in Whitechapel. She had been seen alive less than an hour before her body was discovered, trying to earn money for her lodging. Her throat had been cut with such force that it was nearly severed completely. The attack had been swift and brutal, carried out in near silence. The killer had worked quickly and then disappeared into the night, leaving almost no clues behind. Just over a week later, on September 8th, the body of Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street. Chapman was 47 years old and, like Nichols, had been struggling to find money for her bed that night. The murder of Chapman marked an escalation in the violence. Not only had her throat been cut, but her body had been mutilated in ways that suggested the killer had some knowledge of human anatomy. Items had been removed from the body and taken away. The level of brutality shocked even the hardened residents of the East End, and newspapers across London covered the story extensively. This was when theories about the killer being a doctor or surgeon first began to circulate. The night of September 30th became known as the double event, a reference to the fact that the killer claimed 2 victims in the space of just over an hour. The first was Elizabeth Stride, a 44-year-old woman whose body was found in Dutfield's yard. Her throat had been cut, but unlike the previous victims, her body showed no other injuries. The general belief among investigators and historians is that the killer was interrupted. A man who entered the yard just after the attack apparently startled the perpetrator, who fled before he could complete whatever he had intended to do. Rather than retreating and hiding after this close call, the killer instead moved to another location nearby. Less than an hour later, and roughly a mile away, a police officer on patrol discovered the body of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. Eddowes was 46 years old, and the attack on her was savage. The killer had done to her what he had apparently been prevented from doing to Stride, and more. The mutilations were extensive and carried out with a level of violence that suggested rage and confidence. The fact that he had killed again so quickly after nearly being caught demonstrated a disturbing fearlessness. It was at this crime scene that the shawl later subjected to DNA testing was reportedly found, stained with the victim's blood. After the double event, there was a brief pause in the murders, but the terror was far from over. On November 9th, the killer struck again, and this time the circumstances were different. Mary Jane Kelly was only 25 years old, significantly younger than the other victims. She also had her own room, a small, shabby space in Miller's Court. The killer didn't attack her on the street as he had the others. Instead, he went indoors with her, into a private space where he had time and seclusion. What the police found when they entered that room the following morning was described as beyond anything they had encountered before. Officers who had spent years dealing with violent crime were physically sickened by the scene. The attack had been prolonged and incredibly violent, representing what appeared to be the culmination of the killer's rage. After this murder, the killing stopped. The question of why the police failed to catch Jack the Ripper has been debated for well over a century. It's easy, with modern hindsight, to criticize the Victorian police for their inability to solve the case. However, the reality is that they were working with tools and methods that were primitive by today's standards. The concept of preserving a crime scene was still relatively new. When a body was discovered, crowds of curious onlookers would often gather, trampling over potential evidence. Journalists would arrive and sometimes contaminate the scene in their eagerness to get details for their stories. The police had no way to collect fingerprints, no method for analyzing blood types, and no understanding of DNA or modern forensic techniques. Witness testimony was often contradictory and unreliable. In the dark, foggy streets of Whitechapel, people caught only brief glimpses of individuals. Descriptions varied wildly. Some witnesses described a man who looked shabby and poor, while others reported seeing someone who appeared respectable and well-dressed. There was no way to reconcile these accounts or determine which, if any, were accurate. The police did find some potential clues, but they often didn't know how to interpret them or even recognize their significance. One of the most controversial decisions made during the investigation involved a piece of graffiti found near the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder. Along with a blood-stained piece of her apron, police discovered writing on a wall that read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The meaning of this message was unclear, and its spelling was odd. Some investigators thought it might be a clue left by the killer. However, Sir Charles Warren, the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, made the decision to have it washed away before it could be photographed. His reasoning was that he feared the message might incite anti-Semitic riots in an area that already had significant tensions between different ethnic and religious groups. Whether this was the right decision has been debated ever since, but the result was that a potential piece of evidence was destroyed. The investigation was also hampered by a flood of letters that arrived at newspapers and police stations, many claiming to be from the killer. The most famous of these was the Dear Boss letter, which was signed with the name Jack the Ripper. This letter, which taunted the police and promised more murders, was printed in newspapers and became a sensation. However, most experts now believe it was a hoax, likely written by a journalist seeking to sell more papers. The name Jack the Ripper, which has become so famous, probably came from this fake letter rather than from the killer himself. These hoax letters created enormous confusion and wasted countless hours of police time as they tried to trace their origins and determine which, if any, might be genuine. Despite all these obstacles, the police did develop a list of serious suspects. They investigated various individuals who seemed to fit certain patterns, or who had been reported as behaving suspiciously. Among these suspects were men from various backgrounds and with different potential motives. However, as discussed earlier, Aaron Kosminski stood out to the officers closest to the investigation as the most likely candidate. They watched him, they documented their suspicions, but they could never gather the concrete evidence needed to make an arrest that would hold up in court. Given all the evidence that has been presented, including the DNA analysis, the historical police records, and the timeline that connects Aaron Kosminski to the murders, it might seem that the Jack the Ripper case is finally closed. The DNA from the shawl matches a descendant of Kosminski. The senior detectives who worked the case named him as their prime suspect, and his institutionalization corresponds exactly with the end of the killings. On the surface, this appears to be as close to a definitive answer as we could hope to achieve for a case that is nearly 140 years old. However, the story is not quite as straightforward as it might initially appear, and the announcement of these findings has sparked considerable debate within the community of historians, forensic experts, and Ripper researchers. When Russell Edwards published his findings in 2014, and when the scientific paper detailing the DNA analysis appeared in 2019, the response was far from universally accepted. Many people who have spent years studying the Jack the Ripper case expressed serious doubts about the conclusions. Some were dismissive, others were cautiously skeptical, but very few in the academic and expert community embraced the findings without reservation. Understanding why requires looking at the specific criticisms that have been raised and examining the limitations of the evidence. The most significant concern centers on the issue of contamination. The shawl at the heart of this investigation is not a piece of evidence that has been carefully preserved under controlled conditions since 1888. It is an artifact that has passed through many hands over more than a century. After it was reportedly taken from the crime scene, it became the property of a police officer who kept it as a souvenir, a practice that was not uncommon in the Victorian-era, but would be completely unacceptable by modern standards. The shawl was then passed down through his family for generations. Eventually, it ended up being sold at auction, where Russell Edwards purchased it. Throughout this entire journey, the fabric was handled, stored, and moved numerous times. Each time someone touched the shawl, they potentially left behind traces of their own DNA. Each time it was stored in a new location, it was exposed to environmental contamination. Skin cells, hair, saliva, and other biological material could have been transferred to the fabric at any point during its 120-plus-year history. The challenge for forensic scientists is to distinguish between DNA that might have been present on the shawl in 1888 and genetic material that was added at any point during the subsequent decades. This is an extraordinarily difficult problem, and critics argue that it may be impossible to solve with complete certainty. Dr. Lou Halanen and his team were aware of these concerns and took steps to address them. They used techniques designed to identify degraded DNA that showed characteristics consistent with being very old. They also attempted to map where different DNA samples were found on the fabric, reasoning that material from 1888 would be in specific locations corresponding to the stains, while more recent contamination would be distributed differently. However, critics point out that these measures, while valuable, cannot completely eliminate the possibility of contamination affecting the results. Another issue that has been raised concerns the provenance of the shawl itself. While the DNA testing suggested that the blood on the fabric matched Catherine Eddowes, proving that the shawl was at the crime scene, there are questions about the historical record. Contemporary police reports and inventories from 1888 do not mention a shawl being recovered from the Mitre Square crime scene. This absence from the official documentation has led some researchers to question whether the shawl was actually present at the murder scene, or whether it might have been associated with the case in some other way. It's possible that a police officer took it from the scene without recording it officially, which would explain the lack of documentation. But this remains speculation rather than established fact. The scientific methodology used in the analysis has also faced scrutiny. Some geneticists who were not involved in the research have raised questions about specific technical aspects of the work. Mitochondrial DNA analysis is a well-established technique, but interpreting results from extremely degraded samples requires making certain assumptions and judgments. Different experts can sometimes reach different conclusions when working with the same data, particularly when the samples are as challenging as those from a Victorian-era piece of fabric. A few critics have suggested that additional independent testing by other laboratories would strengthen the findings. But as of now, the shawl remains in private hands and has not been subjected to further analysis by separate research teams. There's also the question of how unique the mitochondrial DNA match actually is. Mitochondrial DNA is less variable than nuclear DNA, which means that unrelated people can sometimes share the same or very similar mitochondrial DNA sequences, particularly if they come from the same general geographic area and ethnic background. The researchers involved in the study argue that the specific combination of matches they found, linking both the victim and the suspect to the same piece of fabric, makes coincidental contamination extremely unlikely. However, without access to the complete raw data and detailed methodology, some scientists remain hesitant to fully endorse the conclusions. Beyond the scientific concerns, there are also those who simply don't want the mystery to be solved. The Jack the Ripper case has generated an enormous amount of interest for well over a century. Countless books have been written, theories have been proposed, and amateur detectives have spent years developing elaborate scenarios about who the killer might have been. For some people, the uncertainty and the ongoing debate are part of what makes the case fascinating. A definitive answer, particularly one that points to a relatively obscure immigrant with mental health problems, rather than to a royal prince, a famous artist, or some other dramatic figure, can feel anticlimactic. The psychological investment in keeping the mystery alive shouldn't be underestimated. It can color how people interpret evidence and what conclusions they are willing to accept. The debate has also taken on some unfortunate undertones related to the amateur nature of part of the investigation. Russell Edwards is not a professional historian or a trained forensic scientist. He is an author and businessman who developed a passionate interest in the case and invested his own money into trying to solve it. Some academics have been dismissive of his involvement, suggesting that important historical research should be left to professionals with proper credentials and institutional backing. While there are valid concerns about methodology and peer review, this attitude also overlooks the fact that many important historical discoveries have been made by dedicated amateurs who brought fresh perspectives to old problems. It's worth noting that the findings have not been entirely rejected by the scholarly community. Some historians and criminologists have expressed cautious support for the conclusions, acknowledging that while the evidence is not perfect, it does represent the strongest scientific link we have between a specific individual and the crimes. They point out that historical research rarely produces absolute certainty, particularly when dealing with events from the 19th century. The standard of proof required in historical analysis is different from what would be needed in a criminal court, and by historical standards, the combination of DNA evidence, police documentation, and circumstantial factors makes a reasonably compelling case. There is also the matter of alternative theories. Over the years, dozens of suspects have been proposed, ranging from members of the royal family to prominent physicians to local tradesmen. Most of these theories rely on circumstantial evidence, speculation, and creative interpretation of historical records. Very few have any physical evidence to support them, and none have DNA evidence linking them to the crime scenes. When compared to these alternatives, the case for Kosminski, despite its limitations, rests on a stronger foundation of tangible evidence. The question of whether the Jack the Ripper case is truly solved ultimately depends on what standard of proof one requires. If we demand absolute certainty with no possibility of error, then the case remains open. The contamination concerns, the gaps in the historical record, and the limitations of the scientific techniques all leave room for doubt. However, if we accept that historical conclusions are generally matters of probability rather than absolute certainty, then the evidence pointing to Aaron Kosminski is quite strong. We have DNA evidence linking him to a crime scene. We have contemporary police officers naming him as their prime suspect. We have his presence in the area where the crimes occurred. And we have the correlation between his institutionalization and the end of the murders. For many people, this combination of factors is sufficient to conclude that Kosminski was indeed Jack the Ripper. For others, the doubts and uncertainties are too significant to accept this conclusion without reservation. The debate continues, and it's likely to continue for years to come. New techniques in DNA analysis may eventually provide additional clarity, or further historical research might uncover documents that either strengthen or weaken the case against Kosminski. What is certain is that the 2014 announcement and the subsequent scientific publication have added an important new dimension to a case that has fascinated people for generations. The Jack the Ripper murders remain a window into Victorian London, revealing the harsh realities of life in the East End, the limitations of 19th century police work, and the vulnerabilities of society's most marginalized people. Whether or not we can say with complete certainty that we know the killer's identity, the case continues to raise important questions about justice, evidence, and how we understand historical truth. The 5 women who died in 1888 deserve to be remembered not just as victims in a famous mystery, but as real people whose lives were cut short by violence. If the DNA evidence has indeed identified their killer, it provides a form of closure that seemed impossible for more than a century. If doubts remain, then the search for answers continues, driven by the same desire for truth and justice that motivated the Victorian detectives who first investigated these terrible crimes.